Hi everyone and welcome back to my channel and Happy New Year! My name is Heather and today I'm here to talk you through all of the books that I read in December. And there are a lot. So I'm going to go through these slightly quicker than I usually do, just to try and save you all a little bit of time, because otherwise we could be here all afternoon. So in December, I reread two books, so I can talk about those fairly quickly. And those were Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte and Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. These were the two books that I did not get to read in September and October, respectively, for Marissa of Blatantly Bookish's Bronte project this year. So I caught up on these in December. And it was really, really wonderful. I was reminded of how much I loved both of these books. And I think watching the Jane Austen versus Emily Bronte debate by Intelligence Squared, which is still available on YouTube, was a big part of that. It really helped me see how brilliant these both are and that you can love both the Brontes and Jane Austen's work, which for a while I was convinced you couldn't. But I'm so pleased that I revisited and have been disabused of that idea. Speaking of Jane Austen, on Jane Austen's birthday, which is December the 16th, I read The Joy of Jane, which is by a variety of authors. And it's a collection of essays about various aspects of Austen's work. It was published in 2017 to celebrate the 200th anniversary of her death. And there were some really fabulous essays in here from authors that I had heard of, like Maggie Lane, and I think Susanna Fullerton might have one in here, Carrie Bebris, who's another Austen author that I really enjoy. But there were also a lot from authors that I hadn't heard of before, and some of them have published other works that I will be on the lookout for in other years. The essays cover such topics as the letters, Pewter and Praise, Pilgrim's Progress, talking about all of these stops that Austen fans tend to make, especially Winchester. Lust and Attraction was really interesting. The Sun of My Life, which talked about sisters, and not only Jane and her sister Cassandra's relationship, but also other sisterly relationships that you see in Austen's work. And my favorite was how she looked at Lucy and Anne Steele, and how Anne Steele will go on and on and on about things, and Lucy is there to cut her off and tell her, okay, enough is enough, stop there. And then reminded me of something that I hadn't thought about, that Miss Bates's sister was Jane Fairfax's mother, and that throughout Emma there's a space where that Jane should be chiming in to cut off Miss Bates, but she's not there anymore. And so that just gives another whole level of tragic to Miss Bates's monologues that I had never thought about before, and that really, really touched me. So I'm very pleased I read this. I'm going to continue on with my physical books before I tell you about the other various books that I read this month, because in terms of physical books, I then hit winter break and just went mad with my free time. So the first book I read at that point was Pages & Co. The Book Smugglers by Anna James. This is book 4 in the Pages & Co. series. It's not a direct sequel to the Tilly trilogy, and it does feature a different main character, but Tilly does still show up often in this book. Also, and this is a slight spoiler alert, this is not a standalone. This is going to continue on as a series in and of itself, which I was slightly disappointed with the cliffhanger, but I also am really excited to see what happens next. So because it is affected by events of the third Tilly book, I can't tell you too much about the plot, but Tilly and her friend Milo, who if you've read the series you'll remember Milo and the train that he lives on, go on a variety of other adventures in order to save their families and a number of literary adventures are had, mainly circling around the Wizard of Oz, but a couple of other books show up as well. It's still very sweet, very nostalgic, and just an absolute treat for book lovers. I then also took the plunge and finally read Bella Poldark, which is the last book in the Poldark series by Winston Graham. So again, because it is the last of 12 books, I can't tell you what it's about because that would spoil a number of things that happen earlier on in the series. But I would highly, highly encourage you to read these, especially from book 8 onwards, because book 8 onwards is very different from what they did with season 5 of the Poldark series. Both of them are good, but they go in very different directions. So I would urge you to read the books as well. But let's just say this still follows the Poldark family and their children and their friends and neighbors as they navigate love and life in Cornwall. We have now reached just post Waterloo, so that's what, 1818 to 1820. And we follow the youngest Poldark child, who is Bella, and her struggles to find both a career and a love and a role for herself in the universe. It was really lovely. It was slightly bittersweet that it's the final book in the series, but I liked that it ended on a very comfy note, and it left it open for me to imagine all of these characters going on with their lives after the close of the book, and it makes it much easier to imagine rereading the series in the future as well. Also, in a Regency theme, I read A Woman of Consequence by Anna Dean, and this is book 3 in the Dido Kent mystery series, which is a series of Regency mysteries about the spinster Miss Dido Kent, who gets invited to a variety of places, and inevitably some sort of mystery happens, and she has to put her very keen and penetrating mind to the task of solving it. It was a good read. I enjoyed it, but it felt very unevenly paced. It didn't really grip me, and I didn't enjoy it as much as I remember enjoying the first 2 books in the series. And I'm wondering if it really isn't as good as the first 2, or has too much time passed between when I read the first 2 books and read this one, or have I read too many other Regency books in between, and I read another Regency book right before this as well, that the contrast in styles meant that I didn't enjoy it as much as I might have. I'm not sure. But it was still a good read. But again, since it's in the middle of a series, I can't tell you much more than that. But I would recommend that you check out the first one if it sounds at all interesting. Then I read some digital books as well. So I have a list on my computer, which is down here in my lap, so excuse me for looking at that. So I read 3 books from NetGalley that I was given as an ebook advanced copy to review this month. The first one was The Return of Hester Linton by Tony Evans. And I was at the disadvantage of not having read the first Hester Linton book, but since they were a collection of short stories, very much a la Sherlock Holmes, I figured it wouldn't be too hard to pick up the general gist, so I went ahead with it anyway. Indeed, Sherlock Holmes is a great metaphor for this series. Hester Linton is painted to be very much a female Sherlock Holmes. They take place in the late Victorian, early Edwardian era. It's not entirely clear exactly when they are. And she is a master detective, and she has her own establishment in which her friend, whose name escapes me right now, but plays very much a Dr. Watson role, to the point of even being the one to record all of their adventures, just like Watson does, go off and solve a variety of cases in London and the surrounding area that people bring to them. Initially, I thought that would be a really good premise, but I found that it wasn't executed very well. Throughout the entirety of these stories, I could not tell you one thing about either of these women, about their likes and dislikes, their personalities. I really couldn't tell you much about them whatsoever. It is each story, each chapter is very much focused on solving the mystery itself and really doesn't leave a lot of room for character development at all, which I can understand from a certain standpoint, but I feel as though Arthur Conan Doyle managed to do that and still give us a perfect idea of what Holmes and Watson were like. So I'm very curious as to why Tony Evans couldn't manage a similar thing. Again, I am at a disadvantage for not having read the first set, and if you'd like more information on what I thought, I wrote a whole review of it, which you can find on Goodreads. The next NetGalley book that I read for review was Circus of Wonders by Elizabeth McNeil. This is a book that I have been desperately waiting for since I loved The Doll Factory. In fact, it's right here behind me on my shelf. I loved it when I read it, so I was really, really excited to see what else Elizabeth McNeil was going to write. This is the story of Nell, who is sold to Jasper Jupiter's Circus of Wonders because of the unusual birthmark patterns that she was born with, which mark her as a sort of leopard girl. And it's about how she finds her place in this world and the roller coaster of emotions that go with being in this world. And that was what I found truly powerful, more than the plot, which is also very gripping, was how each character dealt with being different, be that a physical difference or a feeling of not belonging, of wanting more, because they weren't just varied across the characters, but their reactions changed over time as well, which is very realistic, but I feel like isn't often covered in a book about disabilities and differences. So that was really incredible, and that was what hooked me really, was the character's psychological development. And her writing is of course still beautiful, and I would highly, highly recommend it. I know it's already out in the UK, but I think it comes out in the US in February. And the final NetGalley book that I read in December was Jane and the Year Without a Summer by Stephanie Barron. And this is book 14 in the Jane Austen mystery series, and is again due to be published sometime in February. I have loved this series since I was about 14 or 15 years old, which is a very long time now, longer than I care to think about really. But I felt utterly in love, and this book proved everything right, and it proved to me how much I loved the series, because it's been a good couple years since the last book came out. These mysteries circle around Jane Austen's own life and are partly based in truth. They talk about real visits that she made to a variety of places and real people that she met in her life. Her siblings all make an appearance, her friends make an appearance, along with some fictional characters as well. And wherever she goes, some sort of mystery happens, and Jane is the one to solve it. And what intrigued me most was the style, and I think this may have been one of the reasons why I didn't enjoy Anna Dean's book as much, because Stephanie Barron, especially in this book, has always tried to replicate Austen's style, Austen's writing style, in her own writing, since, at least at the beginning, it was meant to be Jane herself writing these down. I don't know if it's because of my maturity now and how I've gotten used to older styles of writing, or if the style truly has changed since book one. But I found that it wasn't an overblown attempt at recreating Regency English where it just becomes incomprehensible. It was still very easy to follow, but you could tell it was still very much influenced by Jane Austen's style of writing. But it felt very natural, which is a really hard balance to find. So I really applaud Stephanie Barron for that. And especially as we are into late 1816 by this latest book, and we all know what's coming in 1817, the end took a really poignant turn, and the way it was handled was so beautiful. And it was especially poignant because of the book's dedication. The two just played off each other in a really sad but really beautiful way. And I also really enjoyed the little nods to phrases and lines that Austen actually wrote cropping up in the narration or in a particular character's dialogue. It could feel a little bit hokey, but I also think that to real diehard Janeites, it could also feel like a really fun scavenger hunt to be able to pinpoint, ooh, that line comes from this. So overall, through that whole ramble, I really, really enjoyed this book, and I can't wait to own my own copy in a few months. I also borrowed a book from Marissa at Blatantly Bookish, and I knew, or I hoped, that I was going to see her at the end of the month, so I knew I had to read it during the month of December. And that was The Storied Life of A.J. Fikry by Gabrielle Zevin. And this was a book that I probably wouldn't have picked up myself, but Marissa said you have to read it. It's perfect for bookish people. It has the feel of like a made-for-TV Christmas movie. I think you'll like it. So I had to try it, and I did like it. It was a bit darker than that setup had led me to believe, so I didn't get the warm cozies exactly from it that I had been expecting to. But it was still very sweet, and I'm very glad that I read it. It's the story of A.J. Fikry, who owns a bookstore on this tiny little island, I think off the coast of Massachusetts? Although I kept picturing it on the west coast, so I'm not entirely sure, and I'm not entirely sure that it matters, really. But he owns this tiny bookstore and is very resistant to change. He feels like he has lost everything in his life. You find out that he is a widower, and then he loses this rare copy of a work by Edgar Allan Poe. But on that same day that he loses it, this child is left in his bookshop, and no one comes to claim it, so he begins to take care of this child, this little girl, as it turns out. And it follows him throughout his life, and how the bookshop and this little girl lead him to open up more to life and to really relish and savor life. And it was very sweet. Then I realized I was within 10 or fewer books of reading 100 books for the year. So I rose to that challenge. I also read The Rose Garden by Susanna Kearsley. If you've been following me for any amount of months, you know that I have been loving Susanna Kearsley, and I was really excited to read this one. It sounded very much like The Winter Sea, which is one of my favorites, or possibly my favorite of her work so far. But it was set in Cornwall rather than Scotland, but around the same time, and I thought, perfect. It's the perfect merger between my love of Scotland and my love of Poldark. This will be wonderful. And I did enjoy it, but I found the ending very surprising and not always as satisfying as I hoped that it would be. This is the story of Eva, whose sister has died, so she finds herself returning to Cornwall to spread her ashes, and she's staying at this big manor house, which is owned by some friends of hers, trying to figure out what she's going to do next with her life and trying to deal with her grief. But while she's in that house, she discovers that she is able to time travel back to talk with the owners of that manor house in the early 1700s. And she's constantly thrust between those two worlds. A romance starts to form. There are political intrigues going on in the 18th century, and she has to navigate all of those things. And I loved what they did with the relationships in here. I really loved everything. I think the ending would be my only slight complaint, in that it didn't feel as finished and as satisfying as The Winter Seas did, but I still very much enjoyed it. Then, as a couple of quick books, I also finished The Worst Witch series by Jill Murphy. I had 4 other books to go, so I will talk about them here all at once. There you can see the titles. And they were sweet, they were very cute. If you are not familiar with the Worst Witch series, which a lot of people here in the US aren't, it is the story of Mildred Hubble, who goes to Miss Cackle's Academy for Witches, and she doesn't mean to do things incorrectly. She tries very hard at school, but things always manage to go wrong. But she always ends up saving the day in the end. So they're very sweet, they're very quick reads, and I'm really glad that I enjoyed them. They feel very nostalgic for anyone of the Harry Potter generation. They're very much in that same school story type of story, I guess. Then I also got a new puzzle, which was very exciting, so while I started it, I listened to The Chimes by Charles Dickens, which was read by Richard Armitage. This I thought was perfect, as it was close to New Year's Eve, and this takes place around New Year's. And the only way I can think to describe this story is that it's very much like A Christmas Carol, but around New Year's, where this man is very poor, and he and his daughter and her would-be fiancé are trying to pull things together, and they take in this old man and this little girl. But Toby always feels as though the chimes of the local church are speaking to him. And he discovers one night that they are, and they are able to show him his future if the treatment of the poor and their lot in life does not change. That in itself is really interesting, but I would say it fell rather flat for me only because I don't see how he could change that future just on his own. It's not like how Scrooge needs to mend his ways in order to change his fate. Toby's fate is very much dependent on the local magistrates and the local councilmen changing their attitudes so that he is able to make a better life for himself and the people around him are able to live in a better way. So, an interesting idea, but overall not my favorite. Then my final 2 books, well, my last book of the year was First Love by Ivan Turgenev, which is translated from the Russian by Isaiah Berlin, this edition anyway. And I had never read any Turgenev before, but after hearing about him, and especially after hearing him referenced and his work referenced in the latest production of Uncle Vanya that I saw, I was really intrigued to find out, okay, what does it mean when they say we could pretend that we're in a Turgenev novel? And I had seen Carolyn of Carolyn Marie Reads read this, I believe, over the summer, so I was intrigued to try it for myself, and it is quite short. I think it's technically a novella, but it is the story of this young boy who falls in love with his new neighbor, who is a good deal older than he is. He's about 16 and she's about 21, but she is his first love. But things go wrong. You get the idea that she and her family aren't entirely good people, and the twist at the end was completely unexpected. The narrator doesn't see it coming, and I did not either. but I felt the way it was resolved was really unsatisfying. It didn't feel like it was resolved. But then again, maybe that's kind of the point, because it wasn't really resolved within this boy's lifetime either. So overall, it was a mediocre read. I feel like it was good and it was very well thought out. I just didn't particularly enjoy it because you could see how much this young woman was torturing him, and you just felt like going, oh, come on, don't do it. But a book I read before that I enjoyed considerably more, so that this review goes out on a high note, was The Welkin by Lucy Kirkwood. This is a play that I was supposed to see via National Theatre Live in June, I think, of 2020, which clearly did not happen. So I was thrilled to see this book on sale a few months ago when the National Theatre's bookstore came back online. So I bought myself a copy so I could at least read it and get an idea of what I had missed. This play is incredible. I won't give you too many spoilers as to one of my upcoming videos, but it is going to make another appearance on here very soon. This is a play about a group of women who are gathered together in 59, in rural Suffolk. And as everyone else is waiting for Halley's Comet to pass over the village and indeed the country, these 12 women are gathered together as a sort of jury because this young woman, Sally, has been accused of murder, but she then claims that she is pregnant. So these 12 women are gathered to interview her, examine her, and try to determine whether or not she's telling the truth. Is she really pregnant, or is she lying to try to escape a hanging? That in itself sounds really intriguing. This goes by so quickly. It's in 2 acts. That's it, 5 or 6 scenes per act. But so much happens. You get such a clear idea of who these women are. So much emotion comes into play. These characters leapt off the page at me. I could hear them all so clearly just through the written dialogue. The amount of women's issues that are brought up that are still so incredibly relevant, which that last scene really punches home. And the ending is just gut-wrenching. I cannot say enough about this play. If you get a chance to read it, or if it is ever performed again and you get a chance to see it, I would highly, highly recommend that you do. It is just so powerful. And of course, before we go, the last book I need to mention that I read was Timon of Athens by William Shakespeare, which was the last, or I thought was the last, in my Shakespeare project for the year. But I won't tell you much about that here because I have a whole separate review video, which I will link up in the corner here for you to go and watch if you're curious. So those are the 19 books that I managed to read in December. That is not normal for me to not be expecting this long a book haul in the future, or at least not very often. Nor do I usually strive for 100 books. Usually I'm quite happy with whatever total I happen to hit in a year. But since I was so close, and since I knew I wasn't doing much over the holidays, I thought, well, why not? I've got a bunch of short books. I think this is doable this year. So at least I can say I did it once. But what do you think of all of these books? Do you have any more questions for me about them? Do you have any books that you read this month that you think I absolutely have to read? Please let me know down in the comments. And until next time, be safe, be well, and happy reading. Bye everyone.